tout le monde. I call this meeting.
J'ouvre la séance. Bienvenue à la réunion 15 du Comité permanent de la défense nationale de la Chambre des communes.
Hybride, conformément à l'ordre de la Chambre adopté le 25 janvier 2020, et les membres seront présents en personne ou avec l'application Zoom. We'll go through some. We'll put that aside for now, and we'll just go through the rules quickly here. Before speaking, please make sure you wait until I recognize you by name. If you're on video conference, please use the microphone icon to unmute yourself. And to those of you in the room, your microphone will be controlled as normal by the Proceedings and Verification Officer. A reminder that all comments by members should be addressed through the chair. And if I could please ask you when speaking, and this is something I need to remember myself, to speak slowly and clearly in order to help our interpreters. And please, when you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. So, pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February the 9th, 2021, the committee is commencing its study of addressing sexual misconduct issues in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of the Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance. With us today by video conference for the first hour, the Honourable Harjit Sajjan, Minister of National Defence. From the Department of National Defence, Madame Joni Thomas, Deputy Minister, and Admiral Geneviève Bernatchez, Judge Advocate General of the Canadian Armed Forces. After opening remarks from the Minister, we will proceed with rounds of questions, and I would like to advise the committee members that I will be quite rigid with timekeeping today, so please track your time because even though you may not believe it, I really do hate interrupting you. But I would also like to caution the members, we only have a limited amount of time with the Minister today, so I would like to make the most of his and our time. So with that said, we would like to welcome the Honourable Minister Harjit Sajjan, and I would like to invite you to make your opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the Standing Committee on National Defence, thank you for allowing me to address the serious concerns that were brought forward regarding the former Chief of Defence Staff. I was as shocked as everyone else was at the allegations that were made public 2 weeks ago. I want to stress that any inappropriate behavior, harassment, or sexual misconduct is completely unacceptable in the Canadian Armed Forces and in the Department of National Defence. Regarding the allegations involving the former Chief of Defence Staff, the Canadian Forces National Investigation Service has initiated an investigation, so I can't comment on the specifics of the case. I have full confidence that the investigation will proceed fairly and in accordance with the law. And I'm confident that this process will make sure that if the evidence shows wrongdoing, we will hold those responsible accountable. Nobody in Canada is above the law, no matter their rank or position. I know how important it is for any investigation by CFNIS to occur independent from outside influence. The last thing we want here is to undermine the independence of the process, preventing a just outcome. I'm deeply troubled that members of the Canadian Armed Forces have felt that trust has been broken and that people believe that they could not come forward. No matter the rank, no matter the position, sexual misconduct and harassment is not acceptable. We want it reported. We want it investigated. We want to support those impacted. Eliminating sexual misconduct and creating a safe work environment for everyone in the defense team has been one of my top priorities as Minister of National Defence. We have more work to do to ensure that any member of the Canadian Armed Forces or civilian in the Department of National Defence feel able to come forward with complaints without fear of any sort of reprisal. I want to also recognize the women who have come forward with these allegations. We're offering all available resources to them to help support them through this difficult time. Ensuring their well-being must be our focus. We recognize how difficult it can be to bring forward allegations, and we must do more to eliminate the barriers that prevent people from reporting. I treat all allegations of inappropriate behavior, harassment, or sexual misconduct with the utmost seriousness. I can assure you, this committee and all Canadians, that any allegations that were brought forward were aggressively and very quickly put forward to the proper authorities. All of the proper processes were followed. I, along with the defense team, will continue ensuring that the recent allegations are addressed through the proper authorities. We will have a thorough and deep independent investigation separate from the chain of command. You want answers, Canadians want answers, and I want answers. But most importantly, those who have stepped forward with allegations deserve answers. Madam Chair, any inappropriate behavior, harassment, and sexual misconduct damages our institution beyond repair. These actions undermine morale, they jeopardize operational readiness, and they break the trust for those who have volunteered and stepped up to serve Canada. It is a betrayal of the trust between our defense team members and their leadership. Our members and all Canadians expect the Department of National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces to embody a culture where all are treated with dignity and respect. This is work that will and must continue. This is an ongoing and enduring effort. It is one on which we need to do more, and we will do more. When incidents of misconduct do occur and are reported, our members rightfully expect that we undertake a thorough and meaningful investigation. That is what Canadians expect. That is what I expect. I have no tolerance for sexual misconduct. Each and every allegation needs to be investigated, no matter the rank or position of those involved. Whenever any concerns were brought to my attention, I have always insisted and ensured they were brought to the proper authorities for any and all investigations that may be warranted. We will do absolutely everything in our power to make the changes that need to be made to eliminate the scourge from the Canadian Armed Forces and the Department of National Defence. We have taken meaningful steps by releasing a policy on sexual misconduct last year to prevent and address sexual misconduct and to support those who have been affected by it. I also know how hollow this may sound given the current situation. But there are those like Dr. Preston, those in the Sexual Misconduct Response Center, and many members of the Canadian Armed Forces and the Department of National Defence who are tirelessly working to make our institution a safer place for all. We have also launched a panel meant to uncover systemic discrimination and bias within the Canadian Armed Forces. This panel will make recommendations for systemic change based on a number of factors, including gender. As an organization, it is our collective responsibility to support those who have been harmed and to ensure that people are treated fairly. When people come forward with allegations, we must believe and support them to allow the appropriate authorities to investigate. It is the responsibility of every single person in the defense team to respect one another, to hold themselves and their peers accountable, to act according to the values and principles that Canadians expect of us, and to recognize, address, and report unacceptable behavior. We know that we need to do more to help people feel safe and empowered to bring forward their stories. We must eliminate the barriers and the fear that prevent people from coming forward and reporting. And when they do come forward, we must take their concerns seriously. And just as importantly, we must make sure that they are heard. We must ensure that they do not face any retaliation or reprisal, even informally. And we must support them through every step of the process. We must show every single member of the defense team that we are committed to this through meaningful action. Our work has not stopped since 2015, and it will not stop now. Though we have made meaningful progress, we have more work to do. We need a complete and total culture change. Our actions to root out this insidious behavior must match our words. We need to ensure that no matter your rank or position, that your behaviors and attitudes must match the values that Canadians expect, that we ensure a safe and respectful workplace for everyone. The Canadian Armed Forces has traditionally had a culture of masculinity. There are toxic elements of masculinity that have risen to the fore on numerous occasions. To be serious about genuine culture change, we need to acknowledge this and tackle this head on. Though institutional culture change is complex and takes time, the time for patience is over. Change will not and cannot happen on its own. It requires a persistent and complete acknowledgement that we must do better, and we will. Every member across the organization must be invested in it. Every member must be accountable for their actions, no matter their rank, no matter their position. It involves everyone in the chain, from the bottom up and the top down. And it goes without saying that the same rules and standards must apply to all. We must continue building trust in each other and in our organization. Trust that must be continually earned. And we will continue to work to earn it. Madam Chair, thank you for this opportunity to speak, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Minister Sajjan. I will now open the floor for questions. And first up today is Mr. Bazan, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I would like to thank the Minister for appearing. Minister, of course, this has been a lot in the media. It's been reported that former military ombudsman Gary Walbourne had a meeting on March the 1st with you. Is that true, yes or no? March 1st, 2018.
Madam Chair, I have had many meetings with the former ombudsman to discuss important issues.
So are you denying that you met with them on March the 1st, 2018?
Madam Chair, as I stated, I have met with the ombudsman on many occasions. Obviously, our conversations are confidential.
Well, when did you first learn of the allegations against Chief of Defence Staff, where, according to multiple media sources, they were raised with you at that March 1st meeting?
Madam Chair, one thing I can assure all members of this committee and all Canadians is that any allegations or any reporting that were brought to me were always taken to the appropriate authorities very quickly and taken very seriously.
Mr. Minister, according to media sources, multiple individuals have said that General Vance was alleged to have sexual misconduct and was brought to your attention on March the 1st, 2018. What did you do with that information?
Madam Chair, as I stated earlier, our conversations with the Ombudsman are obviously kept confidential so that people can feel comfortable to come forward to the Ombudsman. But one thing I can assure you, that any allegations or any information that were brought forward was always quickly and taken to the appropriate authorities for the appropriate action.
So, Minister, when did you first become aware of the allegations against former Chief of Defence Staff John Vance?
As I stated, Madam Chair, that any information that was any time brought forward was always taken to the appropriate authorities for the appropriate action.
When did that happen?
I can assure, Madam Chair, as I stated, the information when it comes to our discussions with the Ombudsman are always kept confidential to making sure that everybody has the confidence to be able to come forward to the office of the Ombudsman's office. But one thing I can assure you and the members, to answer the member's question directly here, that any information was brought forward was always taken very quickly.
So let me
authorities.
Well, Minister, you're just repeating yourself over and over again. So, you said many times that you have zero tolerance for sexual misconduct. You said it on CTV on May 13th, 2018. You said it November 20th on Twitter in 2018. You said zero tolerance for sexual misconduct of any kind has no place. So if you believe that, then when you had first had these allegations about General Vance brought to your attention, Why didn't you do anything right away? Or did you just willfully turn a blind eye?
Madam Chair, I want to make things very clear here. Somebody have come forward with allegations, and now there's an independent investigation that's currently going on. And I want to make it very clear here that any information that was brought forward was always taking the appropriate authorities. For obvious reasons here, we need to make sure that we protect the integrity of the investigation.
I'm not disagreeing
so that
with you on that,
to give confidence to the people who have finally come forward, so that there is a fair process that can take place.
So, Mr. Minister, under the National Defence Act, Part 1, Section 4, it says under duties that the minister holds office during pleasure and has the management and direction of all matters relating to national defence. This includes everything in the Canadian Armed Forces. Are you aware of your duties under the National Defence Act?
Madam Chair, I'm not only aware of my duties, but also I know that I am not the investigative body. In our democracy, the investigative system is through our police, and we need to always follow the processes to give fairness to anybody who has come forward, so that any allegations can be taken to the appropriate authorities so that they can be investigated properly.
Okay, Mr. Minister, now the Chief of Defence Staff reports to you, and doesn't he serve at the pleasure of the government? Yes or no?
Yes.
So General Jonathan Vance was under your direct command. These are extremely serious allegations of sexual misconduct that were made known to you, and you had the sole responsibility to act and to call that investigation. So why didn't you immediately start that investigation after your March 1st meeting in 2018?
Madam Chair, I think the member should know, as when he was a parliamentary secretary, that as a Minister of National Defence, I don't have the power to launch investigations. That is independent of us. That's why when any information is brought forward, it has to be given to the appropriate authorities, so not to undermine any processes, so that if justice needs to be done, it can be done through an appropriate process. No one outside the police or the appropriate authority should have that power. And the member should know this.
Yeah. So, Mr. Minister, I'll just make a link to when, as Minister, Vice Admiral Mark Norman at the time was suspended for based upon some unproven allegations about him. The government moved very quick to suspend him, and yet here we are. General Vance sat in position for 3 years without any suspension or investigation. Why did that happen?
Madam Chair, as I stated, the discussions with the Ombudsman are always kept confidential, so that anybody who can feel confident to bring anything forward. And I can assure this committee and all parliamentarians and all Canadians that any allegations, if it was brought to me, were always taken to the appropriate authorities.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Bazan. On to Mr. Spengeman, please.
Madam Chair, thank you very much. And Minister, thank you for your time this afternoon for your opening statement. You'll recall from past appearances before this committee that, like yourself, this committee is very engaged in questions of gender equality, equity, diversity, and inclusion since our government took office in 2015. In your opening remarks, I very much appreciate that you referenced trust. You made reference to it in a number of different contexts, and this is about trust on the battlefield, trust in theaters of deployment, trust in the hallways of Defence Headquarters in Ottawa, and trust anywhere else in between. And Minister, in light of recent circumstances, what do we need to do to restore trust of our Canadian Forces members, and particularly female members? And beyond that, how do we work together not only to restore trust, but to empower victims and witnesses of sexual misconduct within the Canadian Armed Forces?
No, thank you very much for that question. Given the current situation, I can understand how this trust has been undermined. And one thing I can assure you that we will be getting to the bottom of what more can we do to determine why somebody could not have the confidence to come forward, because we want to create an environment for everybody to feel comfortable to come forward with any allegations so that it can be investigated. And ultimately, we want to get to the bottom of trying to prevent these type of situations from happening. So these are some of the questions that I have currently. I know that the work that Dr. Preston and some of the defense team members have done has moved the yardstick forward. But obviously here, we need to do more, and we will get to the bottom of determining what type of recommendations are needed and the changes that we need, so that we can rebuild that trust.
Minister, thank you very much. I'm wondering if you could share with the committee your thoughts on the importance of having an independent organization that might be responsible for monitoring and advising on any necessary changes to the Canadian Forces with respect to sexual misconduct. You mentioned independence earlier in your exchange with Mr. Bazan. I think it's very important that we maintain principles of independence and accountability, particularly when it comes to investigations. What are your thoughts going forward on an independent organization?
Obviously, we need to do more here. I'll have the Deputy Minister speak to this, but what I'd also like to say is that Dr. Preston's office is independent from the chain of command. So is the Ombudsman Office, and so is the National Investigative Service as well when it comes to investigations. But obviously here, we need to do more. We need to make sure what more independence that we need to create. So these are the questions that that I also have myself, but I'll have the Deputy Minister take this question.
Yes, thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that there are a number of things that we could look at in terms of independence. The Sexual Misconduct Response Center reports to the Deputy Minister, but is independent of the chain of command, and it is an avenue for members of the armed forces to go to discuss sexual misconduct. The Ombudsman is independent. The National Investigative Service is independent of the chain of command. There are other avenues for reporting misconduct. Certainly, we have our ADM Review Services, who is responsible for disclosures in the Canadian Armed Forces. And there is, for civilian members, the Public Service Disclosure process as well. And so what we need to do is, I think, not create more bodies, but look at the barriers to reporting and the lack of confidence in the system within the chain of command right now, and by members who don't feel that their concerns will be acted upon or who have a fear of reprisal. And I think those are the two things we really have to look into in the department right now.
Thank you so much, Deputy Minister. Minister, I wonder if I could return to you for my final two questions. I'm wondering if you could share with the committee the actions that you've taken since assuming your role to eliminate sexual misconduct. And then more importantly, perhaps if you could speak to the measures that are in place to assess progress and effectiveness of these actions.
No, thank you very much. A lot of action has been taken, and Dr. Preston's team and many members of the defense team have worked very hard to break down those barriers. In terms of the work that we need to change in terms of legislation, Bill C-77 and how that was passed, and now our JAG is working very diligently with the Tiger team to get the legislation and the processes in place to be able to put those support mechanisms in. But obviously here we have a lot more work to do. And as I stated, our mission here is to making sure that we can actually prevent these type of situations from happening, to making sure that we give confidence to the people that they can come forward. So we're going to be looking at the current systems that we have in place, and also look at what more barriers are that we need to break down.
Minister, thank you very much. I'm almost out of time. I'm wondering, just in that context of what you said, that the transparency and public visibility of the mechanisms that we have to assess progress would be fundamental in restoring and creating trust.
No, absolutely, and I think this is something that we have been doing, making sure that we are very transparent with the work that we do. But it just pains me right now that we had members who felt that they could not come forward, and this is something that I think pains the senior members of the defense team. That we do need to do more, and we will do more.
Thank you very much for your candid comments, Minister. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On to Monsieur Brunel-Lucep, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to thank everyone who's here this afternoon and salute them. I'll go as quickly as I can. You can't divulge exactly when you knew it, but when you were informed of the allegations, did you discuss the issues with General Vance, Mr. Minister? I believe you're on mute, sir.
going on. It's extremely important that we protect the integrity of this investigation. But what I will say, and as I stated in my statement,
Parfait. Merci pour la réponse. Logiquement, quand vous l'avez su, logiquement, j'imagine que vous avez donc prévenu le premier ministre.
Thank you for that answer. What did the Prime Minister, what was his reaction when he was informed of these allegations?
Investigation going on. Myself or the Prime Minister are not the investigative body. Every allegation needs to be taken extremely seriously and taken to the appropriate authorities. But I will say, as I stated in my statement, I was shocked just as much as everyone else to learn about the allegations that everybody learned 2 weeks ago.
Parfait. Non, mais ça, je comprends. Pardon de vous couper.
Well, I understand that. I don't want to interrupt you, but I don't see how this would influence the investigation, whatever, if you were to tell us what the Prime Minister's response or reaction was.
All the information were given to the appropriate authorities for the investigation. That's what's always needed, to making sure that any complaint is looked at thoroughly so that it can be determined what actions need to be taken. I, nor the Prime Minister, should not be interfering in any type of investigation.
Fantastic.
Terrific. Let's go elsewhere with these questions. I suppose the investigation may not come into the answer. What have you done to the alleged witnesses once you have learned of those allegations?
As I stated, Madam Chair, the allegations 2 weeks ago that we learned, I was just as shocked as everyone else. But any time during my tenure as Minister of National Defense, if anything that was ever brought to me, I always made sure that it was quickly and sent to the appropriate agency for the thorough investigation. That's one thing I can assure you. And right now, we do have an investigation that's currently going on, and we need to protect the integrity of it so that it can go down the appropriate process.
L'enquête, je comprends, mais bon.
I understand that there's an inquiry or investigation underway, so you don't want to tell us what you did to assist the victims? Okay. Now, the situation of Mr. McNorman, that was said that, including the Prime Minister, that it would end up before the courts. Were you aware of the allegations brought against Mr. Norman at that time?
Previously, when it comes to any type of allegations, once it's out, you cannot comment once the investigation starts. And I'm not going to undermine the investigation.
Okay.
The women that have come forward, we owe it to them to making sure that the appropriate process takes its course. And it's so important for all of us to be able to making sure that we protect the integrity.
Tout à fait. Je pense pas que...
Yes, absolutely correct. I didn't think that my questions would endanger the investigator. Now, on disciplinary issues, are you going? The Defense Act doesn't allow any disciplinary measures against somebody general. Are you going to look for any changes to the law?
What I'll say is that we'll allow the investigation to take its course. However, we will take an independent investigation and look at what the changes need to be made when it comes to the administrative aspect. One thing I am very concerned about is that members felt that they could not come forward. This is something we need to change. And so those are the answers that we need. But we'll take the time to making sure that we get this right, so we can get the appropriate recommendations. And I'm open to suggestions from anyone when it comes to how we can do things better. And that's something that we're committed to doing.
Oui, parce que présentement.
Yes, currently Vance is the only individual who could complain of any disciplinary measures. If there are going to be disciplinary measures taken against Mr. Vance, he will probably seek to defend himself before a court-martial court. So any individual who becomes a Chief of Defense Staff can't be part of the jury. So it's going to be a serious situation. It's a catch-22. Do we still have any time left, Madam Chair? Well, good. What would be the common reaction of a subordinate officer when they are accused? How does it protect the victims or alleged victims if the individual cannot mount a defense for himself?
I can't prejudge any outcome, nor should I. Protecting the integrity of the investigation is extremely important. And I know that a lot of people have questions, and we all want answers. But we need to protect the integrity of the investigation, and more importantly, we need to make sure that the women that are come forward. That has always been my focus, to making sure that we give them the confidence to be able to come forward. And if there's any more out there that they can come forward, that they will be heard, they will be listened to, and that the allegations will be investigated.
All right, merci beaucoup. Okay, Mr. Garrison,
Merci.
please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the Minister for being here today. Mr. Minister, there seems to be an obvious contradiction in what you're saying today. In your opening statement, you say that you are shocked, as everyone else, to hear of these allegations. And yet you imply that you knew about the allegations. So these can't both be true at the same time. So let me ask you very specifically. There's many ways you could have learned about these allegations. They might have come from the previous government, who knew about allegations of sexual misconduct against General Vance and had them investigated before he was appointed. They could have come from the Ombudsman. They could have come from many sources. I'm not asking you to give me the source of your knowledge. I'm asking for you to confirm to me whether you knew or did not know about these allegations before they became public.
Madam Chair, I want to make it very, very clear here. I'm not implying anything. What I'm saying here is that the conversations and the meetings are confidential when it comes to the Ombudsman's office. But what I'm saying here is that any allegation that were any brought forward, we would always take into the appropriate authorities. I'm not implying anything. What I'm also stating here is that I was just as shocked as 2 weeks ago, because right now it's very important for us to protect the integrity of the investigation.
No one's asking about the investigation. We're asking about your actions as the minister. And if you knew about this, you had two different responsibilities that are before the committee today. One is to act to make sure that those were investigated. But there's a second responsibility as the minister, and that's to protect the integrity of Operation Honor and to protect the ability of women to serve equally in the Canadian Armed Forces. So my question very specifically, I'm sorry, Madam Chair, we have a technical problem that I'm getting a echo back to myself here, and I hope that can be solved. And so, okay, it seems to be solved now. So your responsibility as a minister seems to have been breached, I guess I would say, because you knew that there were allegations of a very serious nature against the person in charge of the program for rooting out sexual misconduct in the military. So without disciplining the Chief of Defense Staff, there are other actions you could and should have taken. And one would be to transfer responsibility for that program away from the person who had already been accused. When Operation Honor was launched, General Vance himself said, quote, "It doesn't matter, for even a single incident is too many. Even unintentional harm or offense is unacceptable," end quote. So if that's true, and you actually believe that, why didn't you transfer the responsibility for Operation Honor to another officer as soon as you knew of these very serious allegations?
Madam Chair, I think it's extremely important for members not to make assertions of it, or to make to get it appear like that I'm implying anything here. What I'm stating here is that I need to protect the integrity of the investigation. And as difficult as this may be, we all want answers, right? We all want answers on this, but we have to go through the appropriate process. But one thing I can say, anything, if it was brought to my attention, it was always taken seriously and very quickly, taking the appropriate authority so the appropriate processes can take place and be investigated.
But specifically, Mr. Minister, I'm asking about your other responsibility, which is to protect the integrity of Operation Honor and the ability of women to serve equally. So you had two responsibilities, one to make sure it's investigated, and I'm not asking you about that today. The second responsibility was to protect the integrity of the program to attack sexual misconduct within the Canadian Forces. And I'm asking you today why you did not take that action. It did not require prejudging General Vance at all. It required you to act to protect the integrity of that program by removing the shadow of doubt from it at the highest level.
Madam Chair, one thing I can assure all members, how seriously I take my responsibility when it comes to looking after our people. How seriously I take chapter number 1 of our defense policy when it comes to situations like this. Now, I can't imagine what these women would have gone through because I'm a male. But one thing I can say, I've gone through similar situations of not being heard. So one thing I can assure all the members here, that I take my responsibility to looking after our people extremely seriously, regardless of rank or regardless of position. And all processes were always followed. And I'm here talking to the Canadian Armed Forces members, the women, who need that confidence right now to come forward. And I can assure you that myself and the members of my defense team have been taking this extremely seriously.
Well, let me just say, Mr. Minister, that obviously all of us recognize that it's the bravery of women who've come forward to tell their stories that allow any progress on these issues whatsoever. But at the highest level, we cannot have a person with allegations of sexual misconduct, multiple allegations, in charge of the program to combat sexual misconduct in the military without judging whether or not he's guilty of any of those allegations. It's a mark that impairs the ability to build trust within the Canadian Forces.
Madam Chair, 2 weeks ago, allegations were brought forward, and now the appropriate authorities are taking the steps for the formal investigation. And when it comes to an investigation, it is very important now for all of us to making sure that we protect the integrity of the investigation. And as the member stated, Madam Chair, it is absolutely important, the courage that it took for the women to come forward. Those are the questions that I want answered as well. The Canadians want the answers on, of that the women, why didn't they have the confidence to come forward? Obviously something went wrong there. Those are the questions that we want answered so that we can make the changes so that so they can come forward. But more importantly, how do we find the steps to making sure that we can prevent these type of situations?
All right, thank you very much. On to Madame Aleslev, please.
Well, thank you very much. Minister, could you confirm by providing your calendar of the March 1st Ombudsman meeting in 2018? This doesn't affect the investigation. This is just to confirm that, in fact, on March 1st, 2018, you had a meeting with the Ombudsman. Would you please provide that to this committee?
Sorry, Madam Chair. I have met with the Ombudsman on many different occasions. But one thing I can assure you...
And will you provide your calendar to confirm what those occasions were?
I can assure you that I have met with the Ombudsman on many occasions and quite regularly, and to making sure, but it's extremely important that we protect the confidentiality of the conversations and the meetings.
Absolutely.
So that the people come forward.
Could you please provide a copy of your calendar to this committee to confirm those meetings?
Madam Chair, when it comes to the actual meetings, I don't see the relevance of the question here.
Under the National Defense Act, you have the authority to remove the CDS from his position. Under the Defense Administrative Order and Directive Section 6.2, it states, and I quote, that upon becoming aware of alleged sexual misconduct, a commanding officer must consider whether it is appropriate to remove the respondent from a supervisory, instructional, or command position. Did you do this in the case of the allegations of sexual misconduct against the former Chief of Defense Staff?
Madam Chair, first of all, to answer the question directly, as Minister of National Defense, you do not have the authority to remove a Chief of Defense Staff. But one thing I can assure you, that when it comes to any type of information or any allegation on anybody, was always quickly given to the appropriate authorities for the appropriate investigation to take place.
Le vice-admiral Mark Norman a été suspendu.
Was suspended by General Vance. in the 72 hours following allegations brought against him, unproven allegations by the former CDS. And you supported that decision. Why did you not use the same standard for General Vance?
Chair, it's extremely important that right now we protect the integrity of the investigation. 2 weeks ago, allegations were brought forward, and then now they're being properly investigated by the appropriate authorities.
So are you saying, Minister, that Mark Norman's investigation was compromised because he was suspended from his position, and that's why you didn't want to risk the same thing happening in this investigation, and that's why you decided not to remove the former General Vance as position as CDS?
Madam Chair, the premise of this question, I completely disagree with it. They're making a lot of implications in here. And I can assure you that any time, if any allegations were ever brought to me, they were always very quickly taken to the appropriate authorities so that action could be appropriately taken. I take my responsibility when it comes to looking after our people extremely seriously, especially when it comes to hateful conduct, sexual misconduct. These are the type of things that we want removed. I want answers. Everybody wants answers right now.
Minister?
And right now, with the appropriate investigation, we will get those appropriate answers.
Minister, are you aware of the possibility of any other reports of sexual misconduct, fraternization, harassment, or other inappropriate behavior by any of your general officers currently serving in the Canadian Armed Forces? And have any other investigations or concerns been raised involving officers assigned to the U.S., NATO headquarters, or any other foreign assignment?
Madam Chair, one thing we have to be extremely mindful, we are not the investigative body, that any allegations, if any comes forward, has to be given to the appropriate authorities. That's the process that we have, and it has to be independent of my position, has to be independent of any politician, so that they can be thoroughly investigated, independent of any type of interference. And I can assure you, if any allegations were ever brought forward, it is always taken with the utmost seriousness.
Minister?
All right, thank you very much. On to Mr. Baker, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being here today. Minister, in my view, ensuring that our senior military officials and our Chief of Defense Staff went through a thorough selection process, I think is key to safeguarding our members' safety and confidence in the chain of command. And I understand that the Chief of Defense Staff is a governor and council appointment. In other words, it's not a regular Canadian Armed Forces promotion. And so, the minister can't appoint or remove a Chief of Defense Staff, is my understanding. So my question to you is what can you tell us about the selection process of a prospective Chief of Defense Staff?
I mean, obviously, I can't talk about the selection process for the previous Chief of Defense Staff because we weren't here as government at that time. And the process itself is because it's a government and council appointment, it's not the minister's responsibility. But one thing I can assure you, it's led by PCO. And in this process, it was extremely rigorous and extremely thorough to making sure that the appropriate questions are asked and that the appropriate person is selected. And I believe that that PCO can be answering some of these questions.
Did PCO want to weigh in on that? I guess we'll get that later. Minister, can you talk more about why can you share more about why you can't talk more about the CFNIS investigation? That's something that you said in your opening remarks. So can you clarify why you can't talk about it more?
No, I'm glad you asked that question was asked, Madam Chair. In our democracy, our police are separate entities and independent for investigations. When a complainant comes forward, they needs to be thoroughly investigated because there's a process that takes place. And as a former police officer, I know that the integrity of the investigation has to be independent. So when it does go to, if it ever goes to court, you need to be able to defend the entire process. And that's what we're trying to do here. We have people that just have come forward, and to making sure that they have the proper respect and the process is followed. We need to protect the integrity of the investigation and don't accidentally undermine that. And that it is completely independent of myself as a minister. It is independent of the chain of command. And that's exactly what we want to do so that we can give that confidence to the members who have come forward that they will get the appropriate process and mechanism to support them during this difficult time.
Minister, you have reported media have reported, I'm sorry, not you have reported, media have reported on a meeting that occurred between you and the Ombudsman. And I understand that there is a ministerial directive saying that those conversations are private and confidential. Can you explain why this is necessary?
Well, first of all, it's it is absolutely important that that the conversations and meetings are kept confidential, because the Ombudsman's office itself is an independent body, so that people can come forward, so that when people come forward, they can have that trust that their allegations will be heard, and that also their conversation can be kept private. And the Ombudsman's office independently has the ability to go to the appropriate agencies to start those type of investigations. I, as a minister, don't have the authority to conduct criminal investigations, and nor should we in our democracy. So it's to protect the people who are coming forward. It's also making sure that we encourage people to come forward. We need these independent bodies so that it gives confidence to the system. Otherwise, we'll be undermining that. And I also just want to state here as I stated 2 weeks ago, I was just as shocked as everyone else to learn about these allegations that are currently under investigation.
Thank you, Minister. Minister, you've said that you followed all appropriate processes. You've said that several times. Can you tell us more about the process, what the process is if someone makes a complaint to one of the independent organizations?
I actually will, just to make sure that it is answered properly, I'll have my Deputy Minister or JAG answer that question there.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Madam Chair. I can begin and ask JAG to jump in. The process will depend on where the complaint goes to. If it comes informally to my office, I would refer it to, for example, the NIS. I would certainly bring in the civilian lawyers and the Judge Advocate General. A complaint can go directly to the National Investigation Service from a complainant. It can go from the chain of command to the National Investigative Service. It can go into the chain of command, and depending on what the complaint is, the chain of command can investigate it. So what we have done under the processes to improve transparency and stop interference from the chain of command into sexual misconduct or any other kind of inappropriate behavior is open multiple avenues for affected members to come forward. Once it's in the National Investigative Service process, no one in the chain of command or the departmental management structure or the minister is aware of the investigation for the independence reasons that have already been stated. However, there is a very transparent process to ensure that complaints can come forward and they can be dealt with through a variety of options. As stated earlier as well, the Ombudsman can certainly investigate, again, depending on the nature.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much. On to Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
And thank you once again, Madam Chair. Mr. Minister, on the 14th of January last, you did put out on social media, thank you to the General Vance for his years of service. His work has been very important in protecting the health and safety of Canadians, and you have our gratitude. Were you aware of the allegations on the 14th of January last when you put out this social message?
As I stated, I was just as shocked as everyone else about learning the allegations 2 weeks ago. And that's all I can say there.
Ce que j'en comprends.
So what I've been understanding from the beginning is that we're not going to get too many answers because you have to protect the integrity of the investigation. Now, that means that when the investigation is over, will you be able to tell us when you knew, what you knew? Right now, we don't know because there's an investigation underway. So perhaps once the investigation is complete, you will be able to get that information retroactively.
Madam Chair, I know the complete desire for all of us to want answers, and I have, as I stated, it's so important for me to making sure that what I say always protects the integrity of the investigation. But when it comes to conversations with the ombudsman,
Madam Chair, I don't have much time. The question was very easy to understand. Once the investigation is over, will the minister give us answers to our questions?
But I think it's extremely important. I know you're asking about questions, but we also have questions about wanting people to come forward. We want to create the appropriate institutions. We will just undermine that. So please, it's extremely important that we don't undermine the Ombudsman Office, because you need to create that confidence and independence so that people feel safe. Otherwise, we actually undermine these things. So the main objective here is for people to come forward. And so we can't. And so
d'accord avec vous, Monsieur le Ministre.
I agree 100% with you, Mr. Minister.
With the Ombudsman Office.
Mais je suis 100% d'accord avec.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, Mr. Minister. We have to protect above all the victims, but you can't answer our questions because there's an investigation underway. All right, given. I'll take that. Once it is over, once the investigation is complete, will you give us some answers? Right now, you're saying, you're fudging the question by not answering us directly because there's an investigation. Once it's over.
Fudging anything here. What I'm trying to say here is that it doesn't matter when and where. Protecting the Ombudsman Office and the conversations are extremely important regardless of what the situation is. Changing that, me undermining that, will undermine the confidence that's built here. Life would be so much easier for me to be able to just come out and say things. But no, you need to protect the institutions that we have put into place. We need to protect the investigations that are currently in place. I know this is extremely difficult. It's difficult for me, but we have to right now protect the institutions that we have. We have to protect the investigations. Most importantly, we have to protect the women that have come forward, give them that confidence that they're going to have a fair chance in this process.
All right, thank you very much. On to Mr. Garrison, please.
Beaucoup, Monsieur le Ministre.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. With respect, Mr. Minister, no one's suggesting we should undermine the independence of the Office of the Ombudsman, but you have a second duty here that I've been talking about, and that is to protect your commitment, your government's commitment, and indeed all of Parliament's commitment to the ability of women to serve equally in the armed forces without facing sexual misconduct. So we're in the situation here. If you do not answer the question of when you knew, then the suspicion will be there in public that you knew about this and took no action to remove the Chief of Defence Staff from his responsibilities. So it would not interfere in any way for you to tell us when you knew about this. And I'm not asking you to say what you did in terms of the launching an investigation or who you talked to. All I'm asking is, when did you know about these allegations? And if you can't answer that question, the suspicion will linger that this commitment that you supposedly have and the government has to women serving equally in the armed forces isn't real.
With all due respect, as I stated, no, I do take my responsibility extremely seriously. And when it comes to your words and the implications that you're trying to create with that, and the suspicions word that you're using, I don't have the luxury to be able to come out and do this. My responsibility as a Minister of National Defense is to protect our people. It is, and by doing so, I need to protect the institution when it comes to the Ombudsman Office, so that the process is protected, so that women can feel comfortable to come forward, so that anytime there's a hateful conduct, somebody feels comfortable to come forward. I know how difficult this may be, that we want answers when it comes to this. I know how difficult it used to be when I used to be a police officer, where we can love to talk about things, but no, we have a system in place that has to be protected. And right now, the integrity of the investigation, I can understand some of the politics that some people would like to play as well. But one thing I can assure you, this is I've said is what I can say. 2 weeks ago, I was just as surprised as everyone else. And when it comes to my
if you were just as surprised 2 weeks ago, then you couldn't have known about these allegations. And I also have serious questions about the parallel with Admiral Norman, who had allegations against him. He was promptly removed. You and others in the government commented on his situation at length when he was removed on the basis of allegations. Yet similar, and I would argue even more serious allegations against the Chief of Defense Staff warrant completely different treatment. And I'm having trouble understanding why that's the case.
Hear, hear.
As I stated, Madam Chair, when it comes to any allegations that were ever brought forward, they were always taken to the appropriate authorities very quickly.
All right, thank you very much. I'm sorry, but on to Madame Guillam, please.
To the minister, who are the proper authorities, the Privy Council, the JAG, the allegations were reported to when you learned of it?
Madam Chair, I understand the premise of the question.
Who were the proper authorities that you keep on referring to once you learned of the allegations? Who were they reported to? The Privy Council, the JAG? Who are the proper authorities?
Madam Chair, as when it comes to any type of complaints, there are multiple authorities that we can bring it to. And I can assure you that it was any information that was brought forward was taken to the appropriate authorities.
Which ones? Which ones, Madam Chair?
Madam Chair, as I stated, I can't. When it comes to any information that was brought forward, it was always reported to the appropriate authorities.
So, Minister, you were just as surprised when the news came out. Were you surprised because it was the first time you learned of these allegations, or were you surprised that everyone else had found out?
Madam Chair, I have to be very careful in when it comes to what I say, to making sure that we protect the integrity of the investigation, and that, as I stated in my statement 2 weeks ago, I was just as surprised to learn about the allegations. But when it comes to any allegation that is ever brought forward, is always taken very seriously. This is something that I've taken to heart when I became honest minister. It's from my own previous experience when I worked as a police officer. And also, when it comes to having a voice, I know what it feels like not to be heard.
Okay,
so it's very important to put the right institutions in place and protect the integrity.
The integrity of the investigation. Is the minister under investigation? Are your actions or inactions in the scandal under investigation?
Sorry, can you repeat that, please?
You keep on saying that the investigation must be protected. Are you talking about an investigation into your actions or inactions in this scandal that are under investigation?
Madam Chair, I don't know how to answer assertions, ridiculous assertions in this case.
It's question. Are you under investigation for your inaction or action in this scandal?
No, I'm not under investigation. And if anybody ever was, they wouldn't be known about it.
Okay. We're wondering why you can't answer any questions about the meetings and the timelines. So can you tell us whether or not, according to the military officers, they were saying that you could have done more in addressing the allegations against the former Chief of Defense Staff when you learned about them in March of 2018, but you could have done more. Could you have? Yes or no?
Madam Chair, as I stated, if any information was ever any time brought forward, it was always taken to the appropriate authorities very quickly.
So these were reported in 2018. Is the minister saying he is not the proper authority? He wouldn't come across his desk? He wouldn't be told?
When it comes to allegations of the process, I can have the deputy minister kind of go through this.
No. I asked you whether or not the proper authorities were the JAG or who the proper authorities were, and you just simply said the proper authorities. I want to know who the proper authorities are. We're trying to figure out process here. As Mr. Garrison said, women and men in the Canadian Armed Forces need to know that if they lodge a complaint about sexual assault, that it is going to be addressed. Did you speak with former military ombudsman Gary Walburn following the March 1st, 2018 meeting? Yes or no?
One is I've met with the former ombudsman on a number of occasions because of the work that that the ombudsman does and the reports that he writes. It's extremely important. But when it comes to the actual process, I can have a deputy minister kind of walk through the process again.
When a report of sexual misconduct of this level comes to you, generally speaking, who is it reported to? The Privy Council or the JAG or someone else? Who are the proper authorities?
Yep. Deputy Minister, can you run through the process again? And
no, not the process. I want to know who the proper authorities are. You've repeated the process. I get the process. I want to know who is it reported to once you learn of it.
I'll have the Deputy Minister walk you through the various processes that are actually there to help you answer that question.
But before she does that, Minister, do you think you've lived up to the goals of Op Honor?
Madam Chair, I have taken my job very seriously looking after our people. And I can assure you that, as I stated, no rank, no position comes into play when it comes any type of allegations that we come forward. Okay. And I was just as surprised. No, turn to answer your question, Madam Chair, that I was just as surprised as anybody else 2 weeks ago.
All right,
but having said this, right now it's important.
Thank you very much. Sorry. On to Madame Vandenbeld, please.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much, Deputy Minister Jag, for being here today. I'd like to delve into what I think is becoming an erroneous perception of an inconsistency here, and just ask you a little bit more specifically that if you, with the ombudsperson, the fact that this is an independent body, that if somebody goes to that ombudsperson and provides information, but does not wish to make a formal complaint, hypothetically, and I know you have to be very careful about what you say about this, that whether or not something like that was ever told to you, you can't say if it was or if it wasn't. So presuming that if you didn't know anything, if nothing was told to you, you would not be able to tell this committee that either. And I just wanted to clarify that, and I know you have to be careful, but the fact is that, you know, when you're saying that you were surprised, when you're saying that you were shocked, I don't think that that is inconsistent, given that you cannot even reveal what may or may not have been told to you in the past.
It is, as I stated, it is so important to protect the integrity of that office, so that the confidentiality always is there. That regardless of what the conversation might be, regardless of what somebody else might think those conversations might be, that we have to protect that so that people can come forward. That office is so important. As we're talking about sexual misconduct now, it takes many different complaints. We need to create multiple avenues so that people can come forward. I've been in a place at a time when you feel that you're not being heard, and how protecting the integrity of not only this office, protecting the integrity of the various processes that's independent when it comes to investigations is extremely important to build that confidence. Because ultimately, I know that every member of the committee here, we're talking about trying to put in a system in place to have people come forward. But at the same time, you can't assert and try to accidentally undermine that either. And it pains me that this has taken place. It pains me that women were not felt comfortable to come forward. And this is something that, one, we take very seriously. This is something that we do need to look at deeply. And this is why I've said we will conduct an independent investigation administratively to take a look at those type of issues. What are the changes that we need to make? But now that women have finally come forward, we need to protect the importance of the integrity of the investigation, so that to allow a process to take place. And I can't say more than that. Regardless how uncomfortable it makes me feel, I have to make sure that the protection is there.
All right, I'm afraid we're over an hour for our first panel.
Madam Chair.
So thank you to the witnesses for coming forward today.
Madam Chair. Just want to quickly point out, there's been numerous times here today we've asked the minister about his schedule. I'd ask that he saves us time and having to do a request for papers or do ATIPs or order paper questions, but that he would supply us with the dates and times that he's met with Gary Walborn, the former Ombudsman Minister, just to help with our study. Thank you.
Go ahead, Madame Vanderbilt.
Madam Chair, I do believe that asking for a calendar itinerary would require an order of the House, not of a committee.
Well, I'll tell you what, Mr. Bazan, we'll look into it. All right, and we'll see what's available to us. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us here today. We'll now suspend for about 2-3 minutes so we can change panels. Thank you, everyone. Merci beaucoup.
Merci. Thank you.
To order. The committee is continuing its study of addressing sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, including the allegations against former Chief of the Defence Staff, Jonathan Vance. With us today by video conference for the second hour are the following witnesses from the Privy Council Office: Christine Tremblay, Deputy Clerk, and Janine Sherman, Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet, Senior Personnel and Public Service Renewal. My heartfelt welcome to the two of you. I would now like to invite Madame Tremblay to make her opening statement, and then it will be followed by questions from the floor. Madame Tremblay.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land on which I'm joining you virtually today is the traditional territory, unceded territory of the Huron-Wendat people, while my colleague Janine Sherman is joining you from the land of the unceded traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. My name is Anne-Christine Tremblay. I'm glad to meet you today. I'm Deputy Clerk of the Privy Council, also Associate Secretary to Cabinet and Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs. I was appointed to this role a little over 5 months ago. In context of the pandemic, of course, my principal focus has been to support and advise the Prime Minister, the Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs, and the Cabinet on FPT relations, but also to contribute to the federal support when provinces or territories face particular issues related to the pandemic. I'm accompanied today by my colleague, Janine Sherman. I've mentioned her before. She's the Deputy Secretary to the Cabinet for Senior Personnel and Public Service Renewal. Ms. Sherman is responsible for advice to the Prime Minister and Cabinet on Governor-in-Council appointments, commonly referred to as GICs. Now, before expanding on the roles and responsibilities, I'd like to underscore the importance of safe and inclusive workspaces. Each and every person working within the Government of Canada has the right to work in a safe and healthy and inclusive environment. As Deputy Clerk, this is a very important issue and I take it very seriously. I understand that each situation is unique, but that the right to a safe workplace, free from harassment, applies to all people, all men, all women who work within our public organizations. I also understand that it is our responsibility to take all appropriate measures when there is evidence of inappropriate conduct. In order to provide the committee with some background and context, so that we can speak freely, I'll provide further details about the responsibilities of the PCO, the Privy Council Office, with respect to GIC appointments. PCO supports the Prime Minister in the exercise of his prerogative for these appointments by providing advice both on policy and operational grounds. In practical terms, it translates into the recruitment, appointment, and management of these GICs over the span of their tenure. As the deputy responsible for senior personnel, my colleague, Ms. Sherman, advises government, the Prime Minister and Cabinet, on policy and operations related to GIC appointments, the terms and conditions of their employment, and the management of these individuals throughout their mandated appointment. In the context of the committee study, this last element includes advice on any complaints brought against a GIC appointee. Four main principles are central to managing this complaint. We have to respect procedural fairness for all parties involved. We must support investigations that are independent, fair, and free of all bias. Furthermore, we must safeguard personal information of those involved in respect to the legislative frameworks, in particular, Access to Information Act and the Privacy Act. And finally, respect the confidentiality of advice provided to ministers and the government of the day. In general, when we do have information to provide advice on an issue related to the behavior or conduct of a GIC appointee, we rely on the legislative and policy frameworks, which are based on the four principles I've just outlined. Madam Chair, each case is unique. Our advice will always take into account the specific circumstances. At all times, respect the confidentiality of the process and personal information, which is paramount. Our officials have a legal responsibility as well as a general duty to protect the personal information provided in the context of a complaint. On the specific issue this committee has chosen to study, I'd note that the CFNIS, the Canadian Forces National Investigative Service, has opened an investigation. And while an active investigation of an individual GIC appointee is underway, we must respect the rule of law and preserve the integrity of the investigative process. Consequently, Madam Chair, Ms. Sherman and I will be limited in our ability to respond to certain questions related to specific circumstances. On that point, I would like to thank you, and within these limits, we'd be pleased to respond to your questions. Thank you very much, Madam Tremblay. I'll now open the floor to questions. Mr. Bazans.
Actually, Madam Chair, it should be Mr. Benson first.
Okay. All right, Mr.
And
Benson.
then myself. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, witnesses, and thank you, James. So I'm curious. It's been reported in the media in March of 2018 that these allegations of sexual misconduct against the former Chief of Defence Staff, General Jonathan Vance, was brought to the attention of the Privy Council. Is that correct?
Madame la Présidente, au moment des faits qui sont mentionnés.
Madam Chair, as to the facts that were involved, I was deputy minister in the Quebec government environment and climate change portfolios. I was not part of the federal public service at the time. I was appointed to the federal government as in a deputy ministership of natural resources in 17. Now, the time frame, of course, is important because if I was not a member or associated in any way, I cannot answer on certain grounds. But I would allow Ms. Sherman to reply to these questions if she can.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would say that the information that we would have is personal information. It is nothing that could be spoken about here. Our obligations, as my colleague noted, are we have to be respectful of the Privacy Act, the confidentiality of processes and information that we do receive, and we are not in a position to respond to that.
Well, I mean, it's very important for us to create this timeline of when this information first came about. So we know March 1st, 2018, there was a meeting where the minister was informed of an alleged misconduct. We know that, again, reported in the press, that the Privy Council decided in March that there wasn't enough information to have an investigation. So, you know, it's important to know when you got this information. So when in March did you first find out about these allegations and then in the Privy Council?
Well, I think as mentioned, I believe that the issues that have been reported in the press are, you know, reported in the press. The facts that on which the Privy Council Office response is based is that we did not have information at that time that would have allowed us to take any further action.
Okay, so you did have some information because it was enough to make a decision not to do anything. Do you know if anybody in the Privy Council talked to anybody in the Prime Minister's office about these allegations?
If I may, Madam Chair, the allegations that I believe are being spoken about came to light as the minister had commented, I think, in his recent testimony only a couple of weeks ago. And so I think the comment by myself, the Privy and the Privy Council Office in terms of the information that has been talked about is that we did not have information that would have allowed any action to be taken.
Right. So no conversations between the Privy Council and the Prime Minister's office. That's a no.
In respect of the allegations that you were asking about that have recently arisen?
Yeah.
Correct.
That's it. Okay. So and no conversations between the Privy Council and anybody in the cabinet or the Prime Minister himself. Obviously, another no.
I cannot speak to the nature of the allegations that have given rise to the investigation. As the investigation itself, you know, we cannot get in the way of that investigative process, and so there is nothing I can say in that respect.
Okay. You know, there's an order in council. It's 2019-0496, dated May 9th, 2019, backdated to April 1st of 2018. This order in council was to give General Vance a $45,900 raise. Since the allegations occurred before this, I'm assuming that as this order in council was going through, that there would have been a review done of his job and his performance, a performance review, a professional review of General Vance. Obviously, these allegations would have needed to be reviewed at that point. Can you have any comment about that?
I would say that that you're correct. There are orders in council that are done on an annual basis in respect of setting terms and conditions for GIC appointees, and that changes in their rates of pay are also reflected in those orders in council. There is a what we call the performance management program that is applicable to governor and council appointees. The information and structure of that applies across all GICs. It's available on the website. It is an annual process by which individuals, GIC appointees, submit objectives in written form, an evaluation. There is a rigorous process of review each year in respect of what we call pay at risk. So a portion of a GIC appointee's salary is re-earned every year, and that review process takes place and recommendations are made to the governor and council in respect of what that pay at risk may be in the case of each individual. So that is a process that does apply to all governor and council appointees.
Certainly, if there had been on March 1st of 2018, as we've been told, this conversation where this abuse was allegations of abuse was brought forward, this certainly would have impacted whether he had received his raise or not. He probably would not receive a raise under those with that allegation. So it's troubling to think that this information was out there and that this raise happened after the fact. You know, the other thing I'd like to sort of ask here is that the way the Privy Council has handled this, when there was the slightest allegation against the Governor General, immediately there was this, you know, big investigation done through a third party, consultants brought in, and it was a very, you know, very broad investigation. There was, in fact, at that time, not even any formal complaint. And now we're talking about, allegations, and then nothing's done at all. Is there not a double standard going on here? With the Privy Council, the way they handled one versus the way they're handling the other one?
Madame la Présidente, voulez-vous que je réponde?
Madam Chair, would you like me to try a reply?
Dans le cas du bureau de...
In the case of the Governor General, it was reported that the employees in that organization felt they had no other means of recourse, and therefore they went forward. The reports in the media were compliant with the survey of these federal employees. As each case is unique, we take into consideration the specific facts in the case. In the case that you're examining today, we've heard the previous panel, and it's true that there were other recourses possible within the organization to resolve the situation. This case is completely different.
Much. On to Mr. Bagnall, please.
Sorry. Thank you very much, and thank the witnesses for being here today. We all understand the need and importance for ensuring that those who come forward with allegations of sexual harassment and assault have to be not only encouraged to come forward and not afraid to speak out, but also when they do speak out, that they're heard. How is the Privy Council Office ensuring that people who come forward with harassment claims are heard and also protected from any sort of professional reprisal?
Madame la Présidente, est-ce que vous permettez à ma collègue, Madame...
Would you allow Ms. Sherman, rather, to answer the question?
Okay, thank you. So thank you, Madam Chair. I think, like all federal departments, the Privy Council Office, as an employer, takes very seriously the importance of a safe workplace for our employees. We do have a broader role as well in terms of my own responsibilities in respect of Governor and Council appointees who work in numerous organizations across the federal family. And, we do have terms and conditions of employment for GICs. Those set expectations for GIC appointees in terms of a level of conduct that is respectful and in line with all the federal requirements, such as those set out in the Treasury Board policies against harassment and workplace violence. We adhere to those kinds of guidelines, policies, practices in how and when we manage GIC appointees. We try to ensure that there are known avenues such as ombudspersons in place or accessible to people. The Privy Council are actually in 2017 did conduct a review entitled Safe Workspaces that was published and shared widely with Governor and Council appointees, indeed with all federal departments, leadership across the enterprise, that outlined some of the policies and procedures, the legislative frameworks that are in place, and they are, broadly speaking, they are effective. They provide many avenues of recourse for people. But we also understood that, there are situations where people don't come forward. And there were several recommendations out of that report that apply across the government, as well as in our own situation as a department in Privy Council office. And, it is about getting better information, building awareness about some of the avenues that people have to bring issues forward, and making sure that we are listening and providing access to people to the various recourse mechanisms. And so I would say, I guess, that, we take it very seriously. We do, in terms of practices and procedures, make sure that all of those guidelines are followed. By GIC appointees, we offer information to them in terms of how they manage. When there are complaints about GIC appointees, my office does get involved. We will work with the portfolio departments that may be involved as well, and make sure that we take the appropriate steps to investigate where there are allegations. And where there is not allegations, but concerns, to try and make sure that we are doing everything we can to open that conversation for people to feel comfortable to come forward.
Thank you. I appreciate that and all those efforts. But still, from the testimony today, it appears like a lot of work still needs to be done as we improve the processes you're talking about, encourage people to come forward and feel comfortable coming forward without a fear of reprisal. Can you talk about how we could improve the system when it comes to sexual harassment or assault allegations or even rumors?
Absolutely. Thank you, Madame Chair. Sorry. Madame Tremblay, avez-vous des commentaires?
Any comments, Ms. Tremblay?
Please, maybe, Madam Chairman. So I think it's a very good point. And we spoke, about barrier. We spoke about we have to change culture. We have to improve the process. We have to increase accountability. Alors, je vais revenir en français. Alors,
I'll continue in French. So in order to reinforce policies which protect our employees and ensure that violence or harassment is not tolerated, not condoned, not ignored in the federal government, the Secretariat of the Treasury Board has developed various directives as to the request to have all departments do codes of conduct and terms of harassment, a code of anti-harassment, if you will, which would apply under federal jurisdiction, agencies, organizations, and departments. They are to develop, each department, a plan for anti-harassment, policies and programs, practice and procedure. And they should inquire on each and every complaint received within the organization, that they collect the information and that they finalize remedial action. We must develop a positive, secure workplace environment for all our workplaces federally. We have to have a diversified, representative workplace. These policies came into effect in 2021, earlier in the year. We are currently working on these plans and frameworks, including the creation of a Center for Diversity and Inclusion, Equality, Diversity, Inclusion, EDI, to assist all bureaucrats, employees, to surmount these obstacles, if not completely dismantle them, and to incur or incite a cultural shift within the organization, so that people have the trust that if they bring forth a complaint, they will be dealt with appropriately. Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, please. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and good day, Ms. Sherman, Ms. Tremblay. Thanks for being with us today. Madame Tremblay, when you were appointed in September, you said, did you have to start from scratch, or did you take cases that were already underway? Well, I was appointed to a double role. I'm Deputy Minister of Intergovernmental Affairs on one part. I'm working on the various federal, provincial, territorial, or FPT issues, particularly in the context of the pandemic. It's a very unique position, and while I'm fully aware of the policies involved in what you're discussing today, we have developed within PCO as a group or an organization the expertise to deal with these issues, including Ms. Sherman. Well, I don't mean to be discourteous, but were you aware of which files were underway when you came into your job? Well, the clerk, as you know, of the PCO it's the Prime Minister's branch, if you will. It was his duty to brief me, and he did. Okay, because you said you couldn't answer to certain questions because you were appointed in December, and came into the position in December. Was an inquiry investigation already underway? Well, it's not a file that I was aware of, if it existed, I mean, at that time. Okay, very good. Now, just generally, do you think that a Minister of Defense, do you think that they should be telling you, that minister would inform you of any cases, portfolios that are underway? Not this one in particular, but any. Well, I don't think I can answer that. I'll let my colleague answer. It sounds like a technical question to me. Okay.
I would just clarify that, PCO's role in respect of other departments and complaints or issues of harassment, and the role that I in particular carry out in support of the Prime Minister and other ministers is about the Governor and Council appointees, not generally in terms of the department head. A deputy minister of a department would be responsible for investigations or issues that were within the department, public servants in particular. Our role here is about the Governor and Council appointees.
Non, mais à votre connaissance.
To your knowledge, would the Minister of Defense inform your office if there was any concerns, if there was a case underway?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would say that in respect of a governor in council appointee, we do work to support a particular. If there was a case of a GIC appointee within a portfolio of a department, we would work with them. Yes, in terms of our role in terms of managing GIC appointees in a general way, it would ultimately be we would want to support that department in terms of a process around the complaints, that if there is an allegation that there is, as my colleague mentioned, procedural fairness, that there is going to be a bias-free and independent investigation. The outcome of those investigations is very important in terms of informing next steps. And our job in supporting both the minister and the prime minister around the a GIC appointee is to make sure that that information is collected and under the investigations are undertaken in a way that will enable us to provide advice on next steps. So yes, we could be generally aware of a case of a GIC appointee.
Merci. Et si vous apprenez.
Thank you. And if you were to learn of such an allegation or a situation, who would be dealing with it at Cabinet? Madam Chair, may I defer once again to Ms. Sherman? Yes, please go ahead.
I guess I think the question is who would be aware at Cabinet. I think that while an investigation of particular allegations against a GIC are underway, that information is closely held in the sense that we are working to ensure procedural fairness, to protect confidentiality for all parties. And so the investigation that takes place is indeed for the purpose of determining, whether or not there are findings of harassment, of misconduct, whatever that may be. It is up to the minister who is responsible for that portfolio, perhaps a Crown corporation within a portfolio, for example. And then the minister would make recommendations to the governor in council in terms of next steps. Sorry, I had a bit of reverberation there. Could you hear me?
Oui, non, mais c'est juste, en fait, la question, c'était...
No, yes, it was just a general question. It wasn't about any allegations that we're dealing with today. But if you learn of an allegation or an issue or problem, who would know about it at Cabinet? I don't think there's anything confidential at that point. Just a heads up to Cabinet. May I answer? Yes. Thank you.
Necessarily be discussed by all of Cabinet. As I mentioned, it is up to a responsible minister to make recommendations following an investigation about a particular case. The importance, I guess, that I think you're asking, when and how will people become aware of those allegations, I think. And the point is that while they're allegations, they need to be investigated. When there is a formal complaint, there's a very clear process that is followed in terms of procedural fairness for the complainant and the respondent. That information is managed on a confidential basis. An independent reviewer will conduct the investigation in general, and the findings from that will determine what the next steps may be. If there are findings, that minister would make recommendations about potentially removal of that GIC appointee from their position if the findings are such that recommendation would go. Excuse me.
Donc, quand il y a des allégations de nature.
So when there are allegations, perhaps of a sexual nature, a chief of staff, the prime minister wouldn't know about it until they were proved to be founded or ground for making accusations?
I would I would say, I think, as my colleague mentioned, every case is unique. If there is a situation where allegations are made and there is a danger to someone in the workplace, if there is, a situation where the workplace is under duress in some shape or form, if I can use that word, it is possible, and again, specific to the case and the circumstances, it is possible to remove that person that is being complained about from the workplace on a temporary basis while an investigation is done. So I think, we do try until allegations are proven. That kind of a process is managed in a way that is confidential for all parties in respect of the rule of law, procedural fairness. You have a right to, hear what the complaints are for those to be investigated, proven, responded to. So there is quite a process that must be followed in terms of, when a formal complaint comes forward. And it is not something that is, I guess I would say it is not something that is presented in terms of, it's not an issue that goes to a number of ministers in the form of cabinet. It is something that a minister who is responsible would be aware of.
All right. Thank you very much. Sorry. On to Mr. Garrison, please.
Okay, now we got unmuting to work. Thank you very much for the witnesses for being here today. I just want to follow up where Mr. Brunel Duceppe was going here. What I believe I heard you say that if there was a risk to the workplace that someone could be removed temporarily while allegations were being investigated. And so clearly, if the Chief of Defense Staff, who's in charge of eliminating sexual misconduct in the military, is accused of that very thing, surely this would be a situation which would qualify as something which required his removal, at least temporarily. And so I'm not going to ask you to judge that, but I'm going to say that if the minister, shouldn't it be the role of the minister to inform you if that were the case? So if it was perceived to be that he couldn't do the job because of the allegations without causing serious damage potentially to the program and to the Canadian Forces, is that the responsibility of the minister to inform the PCO if that were the case?
Madame la Présidente, est-ce que vous permettez à ma collègue?
Madam Chair, once again, my colleague to answer the question, please. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think the question, Madam Chair, is about very specifically, and the example I gave was about allegations, formal allegations that have been brought to bear by a complainant. And I would distinguish here between that situation and issues of rumors, unfounded. We do in conducting an investigation, there is a first level of assessment as to whether the particular issues brought forward in a complaint do constitute or would constitute, if they did indeed occur, harassment, for example. So that's an assessment of whether they would if they were true. Once we understand that is indeed the case, an investigation is undertaken. There are a number of steps. The short version of that is there are a number of steps to properly respect procedural fairness, to make sure that we are undertaking investigations.
Excuse me, but with respect, that's not what I'm asking you. I'm asking you that if a minister feels that the person cannot stay in their job because of damage to the organization, is it their responsibility to make you aware of that? Whose responsibility would it be if that determination is made? I'm not asking you to judge whether that's the case here, but whose responsibility would that be?
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I can answer the more specific question. it is up to a minister. Now, I'm being careful here in that a governor and council appointee, it can be a CEO of a crown corporation, it can be a head of a tribunal, it can be any number of those sorts of positions. So the information that does come forward about someone's suitability to be in a position can come from various places. It would be something that the minister would be consulted on and bring forward a view to the governor and council to say, for all these reasons, I think this person is not suitable. And again, it would depend on the kind of appointee. We have governor and council appointees who serve at good behavior. We have some who serve at pleasure. In any case, if concerns are raised, a person, a GIC appointee, is entitled to procedural fairness. They would have a chance to respond to some sort of the concerns that are being raised as to whether or not those were legitimate concerns. Often, those concerns do come through an investigation. It is possible that they could come through some other avenues, but procedural fairness and the right of the individual to make representations would still be something that would be considered.
But with respect, the standard has to be higher than not a criminal. And so we demand the highest standards of behavior. So it may not take an incident-based finding to determine that the person can't continue to do the job that they're supposed to do. And in this case, we have fairly good information that there had been previous investigations of accusations of sexual misconduct against General Vance, and that there had been previous allegations made. And so all I'm saying here is not for you to judge the specific allegations, but when you have a pattern of behavior that affects someone's ability to do the job, it would seem to me the minister has a responsibility. There may be other things in performance evaluation. I mean, I personally have another question about General Vance's suitability. When we went through 6 vice chiefs of defense staff in 6 years, it would seem to me the minister would be asking some questions about that. That's highly unusual. What's going on in an organization that loses senior leadership at that level? So again, if that's a different kind of concern than a complaint, but I'm going to raise it, wouldn't it be the minister's responsibility, if they had a concern about that, to raise that with the Privy Council office?
May I go ahead, Madam Chair?
Oui, s'il vous plaît.
Yes, and I did, as I've pointed out, I guess the performance management process that does apply to GICs is an annual opportunity for considerations about leadership and performance of individuals to be brought to bear. So yes, there are avenues for that, and a minister would have a view on that, absolutely. In the case of GIC appointees, as I said, it could come from a board that is responsible for a CEO. There are a number of avenues for that we do review in terms of overall performance.
Right, thank you. I'm sorry, Mr. Garrison. I tried to let it go as long as I could. On to Mr. Bazan, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank our witnesses for appearing. Now, just following up on Mr. Garrison's line there, talking about, performance, let's go back to the situation that, we have General Vance, who there's allegations that came forward reportedly in 2018, and then he was given a raise May 9th, 2019 in the amount of $45,900. Does the PCO do that performance themselves, or is that performance coming from the deputy minister? Is that coming from the minister? Or how does it happen that the CDS is then approved for such a performance bonus?
Madame la Présidente, est-ce que vous permettez, Madame Sherman, d'expliquer?
Once again, perhaps Ms. Sherman could describe the performance management process? Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I guess I would say that the the performance review process is managed by PCO in support of, as part of our responsibilities in managing the Governor and Council community, which, as I mentioned, is very broad. It does have some general parameters for the process that is used in terms of CEOs of Crown, Chief Executive Officers of Crown corporations, tribunals, are not usually part of a performance process given their independence.
So what would
have
be
a different
applied
pay structure.
in the CDS? Would
And
that...
so, yeah, and deputy ministers are another category. The Chief of Defence Staff is a bit unique. He is a Governor and Council appointee and therefore is subject to the same pay at risk schedule. And the recommendations are brought forward based on both his objectives, his self-evaluation, and some due diligence and around performance.
So would that due diligence looked back from March 2018 until the raise was issued in May of 2019?
Yeah, it would cover the year. We go on fiscal years, so something that took effect, on April 1st would be in respect of the previous year, and those are recommendations. What we do is support the recommendations that come forward to the Governor and Council, and it is the Governor and Council that makes decisions on the pay at risk for all Governor and Council appointees.
Madam Chair, if I could, we know that according to media reports on February the 5th, that a spokesperson for the PCO acknowledged the fact that there was a complaint made about General Vance in March of 2018. Yet they say that with respect to your question, there's no information was provided to PCO which would have enabled further action to have been taken. So again, we come back to what did the PCO know and why didn't they act compared to when there was an allegation made against the former Governor General, which resulted in a full investigation and ultimately her resignation.
No, we'll allow the witness to answer that question if she can.
Thank you, Madam President. I want to be very specific here in terms of you're asking me about allegations, and I believe that the information that PCO did provide in terms of the response to media inquiries was that we did not have information that enabled any action to be taken. That is that's the situation. And when we are speaking about allegations, and when I'm using the word allegations, I am talking about formal complaints. And there is going to be a difference in how a formal complaint is managed, as we have described here, versus other information that may be rumors, concerns. And I guess the one other point I would make, and my colleague did explain that every case is unique, circumstances differ from one to the other. It is difficult to compare, but the process that was used in respect of the Office of the Secretary to the Governor General was a fact-finding review. It was about the workplace. So if there was a
fact-finding review, why wouldn't we do a fact-finding review when allegations were first presented on General Vance? How come the information is being dealt with here so differently? Especially when you're talking about sexual misconduct.
Go ahead, Madame Sherman.
Yes. Thank you. Again, it is very difficult, and I guess, counsel not comparing situations from one organization to another. There were, as my colleague has mentioned, there were a number of people that had come forward to the media in the feeling that recourse mechanisms were not working for them. There was a great similarity between some of those concerns and some of the results from the Public Service Employee Survey. and therefore there was a different, there was a recognition that more information was needed.
Final question, Madam Chair. Just on the appointment process on the CDS, on the Chief of Defense Staff, because he's Governor and Council, but he's also one of the highest security clearances members of the Armed Forces and the Civil Service. Who does that appointment report to in the Governor and Council? Wouldn't it be the Minister of National Defense, or is it to the Prime Minister directly?
Madame la Présidente, voulez-vous que je...
Madam Chair, can I describe the process, or do we answer specifically to the question?
No,
Specifically, who does the CDS report to? General question
Alors-
about all CDSs.
Alors, je tournerai à ma collègue, Madame Sherman, pour la question spécifique.
Once again, Ms. Sherman for the specific question. Thank you.
Go
Thank you. The CDS is appointed under the provisions of the National Defense Act by the Governor and Council. He does report to the minister in the context of his responsibilities, but he is the, as you know, has the management of the forces under his.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Robillard, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My question would be addressed to Ms. Sherman. What is the complaint process if there are complaints against a GIC incumbent? Is it a different one than for the rest of the public service? Madam Chair, Mr. Robillard, I think I addressed the question to Ms. Sherman, so I will let her answer the question.
Thank you very much for the question, Madam Chair. The process is the same as for the public service in the sense that it is a process that does involve procedural fairness, independent investigations. When people bring complaints forward, they are evaluated in terms of how whether or not they would meet, for example, the test if it's an issue of harassment. And if there is grounds for that, then an investigation is undertaken. And they do follow the same process. The Treasury Board process is the guide by which we conduct, we and relevant departments would conduct an investigation for a Governor and Council appointee. I think that hopefully that answers your question.
Yes, Madame Sherman, ou ça peut être Madame.
Well, either Madame Sherman or Madame Tremblay, what avenues are available if there's no official complaint lodged?
Est-ce que Madame Sherman peut répondre?
Perhaps Ms. Sherman could try to answer that one as well? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If there is no complaint launched, I think it very much depends on the context of the information, how it is brought about, what it is about. It's a difficult question to answer. I think I would say that we all are motivated and responsive to these things in the context of the government's approach and the policies and procedures that exist and our efforts to ensure safe and healthy workplaces for all employees. And so we do have to look into situations where if there are concerns raised about behavior, conduct of a GIC appointee, it is a difficult question to answer because a lot depends on where that information is coming from. but I guess I would say that we do take concerns seriously. We do want to make sure that workplaces are safe and harassment free. As my colleague has spoken about, zero tolerance in terms of behavior that is not conducive to that. The government has part of the terms and conditions for governor and council appointees, and the Prime Minister's guidance in open and accountable government requires GIC appointees to act in ethical, honest, and respectful ways in carrying out their responsibilities.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Madame.
Thanks again, Madam Chair. I know there's not much time. I'll be quick. You provide counsel and advice to very important people in the government. What would you suggest or recommend to an individual who might be accused of sexual misconduct? Madam Chair, I'll try to start the answer, and then perhaps my colleague can add something. What we're trying to do is to create a zero-tolerance climate and environment. So if there are allegations, people might be afraid to complain. What we're trying to do is new ways of doing things. It's a culture shift that we need, so that in future, in cases where there might be inappropriate conduct, sexual matters perhaps, that remedies can be found. Have you provided this type of recommendation or advice in the past? Well, quite frankly, as a deputy minister myself for over 10 years in Quebec, in my own organization, we've had to face occasionally some cases where decisions had to be taken. Okay. Well, do you think it might have been appropriate to do it in a case like today? I'm afraid I cannot answer that question in any fashion whatsoever. How about your colleague? Can she provide an answer? Ms. Sherman, could you answer the question?
On that either.
Est-ce que techniquement le
Technically speaking, could PCO contact a member of the CDS to confirm or validate information that they've obtained from some source? Well, I think in this case it's a fairly technical answer. Ms. Sherman may answer, but PCO has conversations and contacts with any number of deputy ministers or other GIC appointees. So I would, well, that's what I can say, but maybe Ms. Sherman has something else to add. Well, no, that's fine. You've answered my question. Well, thank you very much to our witnesses. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I would like to ask a very specific question about cases of sexual misconduct. In the case of General Vance, we've had both media reports and comments from the General himself that he was twice before he was appointed Chief of Defense Staff accused of sexual misconduct, and on at least one occasion was investigated by the Canadian military. Would that material be maintained in personnel files of a GIC appointee? So I'm not asking you to confirm it in this case, but if that's the case, and General Vance has confirmed it, would that material be maintained in a personnel file that would be accessible to the PCO?
Madame la Présidente, si vous permettez, je pense que cette question.
Once again, Madam Chair, I think this is more under the expertise of my colleagues, so I seek for her to answer the question, if you allow.
Chair. I would make a distinction if here in terms of an investigation by the military would not be part of our file. would not be, and I think it is important to, and as I said, the CDS is a bit of a unique function in that, as part of the military and a governing council appointee, but we would not have military files in our records.
Even though this investigation was done either just before or after he had been appointed Chief of Defense Staff?
If I may, I think I guess the question about, the actual investigative report would not be something that we would have. Any information about an individual that is related to their appointment would be personal information that would be protected as such.
I think what makes this also unique is not just as the Chief of Defense Staff, but it's sexual misconduct. And we all know from looking at it that this is usually not a case of one slip up by someone. This is a case of revealing of attitudes toward women. And so this is why when we have a pattern of allegations, whether or not they're proven allegations, it brings into question the ability of someone to meet the highest standards of behavior in their job as Chief of Defense Staff. So it would be of concern to me if you didn't keep that kind of information about people who are occupying the highest offices. But I want to know whether ministers could access whatever files you do have. So if a minister had concerns about a GIC's performance, can they ask you to see what's in their file?
If excuse me, est-ce que je peux répondre?
Oui, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I would just clarify that a minister that is responsible for the performance for a GIC appointee within their portfolio would indeed have access to that performance information. They would have potentially, have had a view on that person. So and may have been consulted in terms of their perspective in terms of the performance of that individual. So would they have access to it? It is personal information about an individual, and would not necessarily have access to it after the fact. I would also, I guess, highlight that, our job in the public service context is to support the government of the day. We do so in a way that respects all of our legal obligations around things like the Privacy Act and the confidentiality of the offices that we hold.
Right. And with that, I'd really like to thank our witnesses. Thank you for your patience. It's been a long afternoon. I know it's been 4 hours. I thank you for joining us today, for the excellent questions for the committee members. And with that, meeting is adjourned. Merci.
Merci. Merci beaucoup.